So once you are done placing all the objects and making sure that they're on their right layers, you can begin to think about creating your first rendering. So I'm going to go into my photo mode, and you can see here that normally when we go into photo mode, if we don't have any effects set to our view, it'll show up just like this. So it looks like a blank panel to the side. When I have a photo that has an effect stack applied to it, you can see all of these different effects that are going on. So for example, in this view, I have 2-point perspective. I have made alterations to the sun, sky, and shadows. I've done some color correction. I have a reflection plane. And then I'm going to go through some of the other effects that you can add to your view. So first of all, let's just add a new view. I'm going to go to this camera, and I'm going to just like maybe zoom in over here. I think I was. All right, I'll save this and start working with it. So if you hit this little effects panel, it will bring up a whole bunch of effects that you can add to your view. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to show you a few that you will find helpful right away, because it can be really easy to get overwhelmed. And also there's a bunch of videos both on the Lumion website and a lot of other people on YouTube who have gone through like what each of these effects is. The things that'll be more important are the sun, because you want to control the time of day. So this will allow you to do something different from what's in the build mode. I like this because it's casting some pretty long shadows, but it's catching the highlight of these trees, which are kind of my frame right now. So let's keep our sun like that. The other effect that we will start with, which is I think one of the more important ones, is 2-point perspective, which I believe is under camera as well if you are if you don't have anything in your featured panels. So 2-point perspective is basically going to straighten all your verticals out just like it does in Rhino. So you can see there's just a little bit of a difference here, but it makes a big difference if you have visible upright elements. So I'm going to activate that. And you can move effects around by using these arrows. The layering doesn't matter a lot for most things, but there are just a few items where it does matter. So I'll make sure I point those out to you when it comes down to it. Along with our sun, we also want skies. So there's a couple options. If you want to have a lot of control over the amount of clouds and the types of clouds, you would use the skies and clouds setting and then play around with the sliders there. I like to use real skies, and within real skies it's basically a bunch of background images that you can select from, and they're HDMI, so they actually can impact the lighting of the view. So you see now it's changed my entire lighting scenario because the sky is over top of the sun. If I moved this down, now the sky would show up, but the sun would still be in the same place that I set it. So the important thing to remember is you want to select a sky that is approximately the same time of day as the view that you're creating. So mine would be either a morning view or a sunset view, because my sun is kind of getting lower in the sky. So I would go through and select a sky that feels appropriate to me. I might take like a morning view, maybe this one looks good. And that seems to kind of fit the lighting scenario better. And you can change the heading of this. The heading is just like the rotation and how you see it. Keep in mind that like where the bright spot is where the sun is. So I'm just gonna match that up approximately to where the sun is in my sky. And I'm gonna leave everything else as is. I'm going to add a shadow. In advanced, we will go to shadow. And in shadows, the thing that is important to control is this sun shadow range. For a site model like this, which is really large, you want to turn that all the way up. If you have it down, you'll find that some of your shadows are clipped or don't, some objects don't get shaded properly. So I would just turn that all the way up. The coloring is like the the color of the shadows itself. And I find when it's an exterior view that they're a little bit more blue, so I tend to turn this up a little bit. And then I also increase my brightness of the shadows just so that they don't kind of overwhelm the ground plane. Now this interior exterior slider, on default, it's turned all the way to the left, which is interior, and I'm just going to turn it up. And you see that our shadows are getting more blue the more I change it to exterior, because it's assessing the view and saying like, okay, we have a skylight and the skylight is a blue sky, so the shadows are going to take on more of a blue tone when they're outside. This Omni shadow just lends a little bit more detail to elements where they sit on the ground. You can kind of see under the play equipment that things are getting a little bit more detailed there. So I'm just going to keep this at 1. And then shadow correction is something that kind of lightens up really dark shadows. I usually just kind of keep it somewhere in the lower half of the range. And then there's this shadow type. I want soft shadows, so you can see the difference between these hard shadows, which are basically taking a cast of these elements and pushing them across the ground plane, versus soft shadows, which is a lot more realistic. So you want to turn on soft shadows. And then if you turn on fine detail shadows, you will notice that elements become a lot more detailed. So within the grass and within your trees, you're going to notice that the leaves take on much more detail. So just be aware that this can take up memory when you're rendering. So use it selectively depending on if your computer can handle it. So we have our 2-point perspective, our real sky, our sun and shadows, and that's pretty much enough to start. But if you want to do a few more effects, I'm going to show you some fun things. So Skylight, this is an element that is going to really increase your render times. So again, this is something that you should use sparingly, but it does increase the realism of the lighting in the environment. So I like to turn mine up just a little bit, and then I turn my saturation down just a little bit. And if I use the skylight in reflections like this, if I have reflective elements, like for example, if this was a water view, or if I had paving that had reflections on it because it was wet, then that would show up, the skylight would show up in those reflections. And I just want to point something out, which it says, click inside the preview window to update. So right now we're seeing kind of like an approximate view of what this is going to look like. If we click inside, then Lumion's going to calculate the lighting and show us kind of like an even more realistic preview of what this will look like. If your Lumion is not running super fast, you probably don't want to click inside this window too often because it's going to take a long time to update. But now I can have a really clear sense of what my view is going to look like. And just so you can see the difference, I'm going to turn the skylight off and click in again. And you can see it's a lot warmer, this view, which some people might really like, but I find it better to warm the view up in a different way. So I like to turn my skylight on. You can see it just like there's more light that's imbued throughout the view. So the other thing to think about is the reflection plane. If you have a water view, or you have paving that has a reflective quality, or you have glass in your view, you will want to use reflection planes. Basically, I would enable this, and then I would go down to your reflection planes and use this little pencil to select them. So in this particular view, I'm just going to use this sidewalk as an example. You will add a new plane, and then you see that it highlights any plane that is applicable in green. So I'm going to click onto this path, and it will select all of the layers in that path, and I'm going to click OK. And now in my window, I can see that there is a reflection in this path from the trees and all of the other elements. You can see in the kind of puddles that they're getting reflected there. This would be much more visible if this was a water plane or a mirrored element or glass, but that's not the view that I'm working with right now. I'll just show you how those work. So you can just select planes. You can select up to 10. The more planes you add, the more memory it's going to cost you. So again, for each view, If you don't need this, you can just turn it off and not use it. But let's say, for example, you are doing a water view over here, and we select this water as a reflecting plane. Now in my view, you can see that all of the trees are reflected in that image like really, really well. So right now I have a ton of people in it. It's not really optimized for this view, but you get the idea that these reflection planes are like highly accurate. But again, if you don't have anything reflective in your view, just get rid of that effect. You don't need it. You can just use the double clicking on the garbage can to get rid of an effect. There are a bunch of so-called artistic filters, and you are welcome to experiment with these. The only ones that I find super useful are the styrofoam mode, which basically turns your entire view into like a white styrofoam model. So that can be kind of useful, but you have to really watch these settings. So I usually turn the diffusion right down, and then I turn the noise reduction way up. You can change the color of what that styrofoam is supposed to be, and I have found that like a very slightly warm white color is usually better than just bright white. So if you were looking to just create like a basic shadow file for your view, and then you wanted to like go beyond photorealism and just do something interesting with the shadows and move on into Photoshop and add elements there, you could render out a situation like this. All right, when you're not using an effect, you can either turn it off like this, or you can just delete it if you're not going to use it. Yeah, the other thing that's important is this layer visibility. So if you want to be selective about what objects are visible in your view, you can do that with layer visibility. So right now I have scale figures turned off. So I had scale figures in my drawing, I just used silhouettes, and I have those turned off. So if I wanted to do a rendering that didn't have any people, because I was going to add the people in Photoshop, then I could just render this view as it is like this without any people, and then I could create another view with exactly the same viewpoint. And I can go over here, click here and go edit, copy effects, go to my second view and go edit, paste effects. And now I can just change that layer visibility so that my people are back on. And so I could set this to render two versions, one without people and one with people. And that way you can set up a bunch of different things to render at the same time, and you can composite them in Photoshop later. So the last thing I'll show you is the weather effects, and that is in weather. So there's a fog effect here, which can be useful if you don't want it associated with any other weather type, but this precipitation one is the one that I use for winter views or rain. So you can see like, wow, that is really a rainy view. You can begin to control all of those elements here. So this is all the way over here to rain. If we move this forward, we're gonna get snow. So that's pretty awesome. Obviously, then we would have to go through and select all of our trees and replace them with winter view trees. We can't have trees with leaves and snow. That's not gonna work. You can choose the precipitation phase, which is basically like how advanced is this scenario right now. So is it like a light dusting of snow that's just barely started, or is it like heavy snow that's covering everything, or are we just like melting out and going back to spring? So you can play with this slider and see where it lands that you like. The particle speed is more for animation, so you don't really have to pay attention to that. I'm just going to turn it all the way down. Particle quantity is how much of the rain or snow you actually see. So the higher the quantity, the more closer to a blizzard we are. If this was down at rain, it would be like a downpour. And then if we turn this down, then we see we get fewer and fewer raindrops or less snow. The size, just large or small. And this blocked by plants and trees is like, how much do you want the canopy to block out the ground plane from getting this moisture set down onto it? So if you set this all the way down, it's basically going to ignore the tree canopy and just put a layer of precipitation all over the ground plane. Whereas if you increase this, it's going to say like every time there's a model in place, it's going to block out that weather from happening underneath it. So you can play with that slider as well. The blocking distance is essentially like how far from the sky you're blocking elements. I just leave it down here. This extra fog addition is kind of cool. So basically you can make this more foggy and it will be more atmospheric. So you see how it kind of like fades out the background and adds a lot of depth to the image. So the foreground is really, really crisp and clear, and then it kind of like really fades back. So if you're doing a winter view or a rainy view, it's really fun to play with this weather and see what you can do with it. The block bias is similar to the blocked by plants and trees. It just controls how much of the snow falls on the elements on the ground plane. So this isn't to do with the canopy blocking things. This is actually just the surface itself. So again, this is a slider you can play around with if you want. I'm going to leave it all the way up, which is I think where its default is. And then there's some rain stuff. If you had glass on your model, for example, if you were in a building looking out onto a rainy scene, you would probably want to activate your rain streaks on your glass panel, but we aren't dealing with that because we're doing an exterior view, so we don't need to worry about that. I'm just going to lower down the fog a little bit and increase my particle quantity and increase the size. And we would probably want to change our sky to something cloudy if it was snowing. So maybe I would take like a more moody sky like this. Now it's kind of weird because we're still seeing the sunlight come through. So you have to make some decisions about whether you want to really see snow falling or whether it's good enough to just have snow or rain on the ground. If you want to reduce the amount of precipitation you're seeing, remember you can just take down the particle quantity to 0, and that way you'll just see the impact of the weather instead of seeing it actively happening in front of you. So let's go back to rain. This is kind of cool. We'll say it's maybe has just recently rained and maybe the sun is passing over this site now. And so we have a few kind of like reflective areas where there's puddles of water, in which case maybe it's like a good idea for us to set our reflection plane here. So I'm going to go back and add a reflection plane. So now you can see on the wet spots of the sand, there's just a slight amount of reflection from the trees that are around it. So if you were happy with this effect stack and you wanted to save it, you can go to this little menu up here and click on File and then go Save Effects. And I always keep this in my 3D file in Lumion under the Effects folder. So I have all the effects that I'm using within my view saved here. And you can just name this something that's appropriate to your file. Maybe it's rainy afternoon. And just click Save. And that way, if you want to apply it to any other view that you want to change, you can just go here, go to File, Load Effects, and grab that, and it will apply those effects here. Now remember, for this one, we want the people turned on, so you'd have to go back and turn your people layer on. So that's essentially the basics of setting up the effects in Lumion's effects stacks and panels. And those are really, really, really effective for getting atmosphere and seasonality within our view.